Given the fact that last week I called all of us murderers and you still came back, I thought I would try this week and call all of us adulterers and see what happens, okay? Because here's another one of those commandments that make it seemingly easy for us to distinguish between us and them. This is one of those places where we can go, where many can go in the Bible and say, okay, well, this does not describe me. This may describe him, it may describe her, but at this particular point, right here, I'm not being described. He's an adulterer, she's an adulterer. Thank God I'm not like them. But when we shrink the reach of commandments like this so that its violations exclude us, this is the reason why so many of us aren't amazed by grace. We shrink the commandment down to such a degree that it doesn't include us. It narrows the command, it narrows the demand in the sense that it doesn't reach us. And so when this happens, when we do this, it's no wonder that so many people are not amazed by grace. And when this happens, this not only fuels self-righteousness, thank God I'm not like them. This is a place where I'm not guilty, even though he or she is. It not only fuels self-righteousness, but it also sucks the life out of beautiful things like empathy and understanding and forgiveness toward those who have really messed up. It sort of eliminates that stuff when we can no longer associate with, or we think we are different than the person who is guilty of this. It shrinks empathy. It eliminates beautiful things. It sucks the life out of beautiful things like understanding and forgiveness toward those who've really messed up. You know someone really understands the radicality of God's grace and forgiveness toward them when you confess your sins and secrets to them and they don't blink. That's one way you know that someone has been captivated by God's amazing grace and his one-way love toward them. That's one way you know that someone has been absolutely captivated by God's mercy and God's forgiveness. When you confess your sins and your secrets to them and they don't blink. Non-blinking friends are those who know that they are the chief of sinners, and those are the ones that you run to when you've really blown it. Those are the ones that come to mind when you've really blown it. Those are the ones that you go to. I was talking to my mom a couple weeks ago and I said, Christians should be the first people we run to when we've really blown it, but all too often they're the last. They should be the first people. They should be the first people that we think of, that we run to when we've really messed up, when we've really blown it. But all too often, they're the last. And that led me, after that conversation with my mom, that led me to send out this tweet. Is your church the first place or the last place you'd go if it was discovered how bad you really are? That's a pretty big question. Is your church the first place or the last place you'd run to, you'd go, if it was discovered how bad you really were, if all of your secrets and sins were exposed? Is church the first place or the last place you'd run to? And in my experience anyway, church is all too often the last place that people go to. And that's another reason why Liberate exists. We want that to change, not just for our church, but for all churches. We want the church to be the first place people think of when they've really blown it, when they've messed up, the first place people run to when they've been exposed. We want pastors to be the first people that sinners go to when they discover just how deep their guilt runs. We want Christians to be the first people that come to mind when we're really going through something painful and difficult, and we're not afraid to show them our sin because they know how sinful they are. So if we're alive today because of God's outrageous mercy and amazing grace and unconditional love for us, then we should be widely known as the first people sinners run to, not the last, because we will see ourselves first as murderers and adulterers. And trust me, God has his ways of reminding us how bad we are when we forget. He has his ways. The fact is that the people in the biggest chains and darkest prisons are not people who know that they are adulterers and murderers. It's the people who think that they aren't. And that's why there are Christian men and women locked away in prison for life, literal prison for life, behind bars, who are freer than most people inside the church. People who have committed heinous sins, who have confessed those sins, heinous crimes, who have confessed their sin and repented of their sin, and who live their life behind bars, literally, who are more free than lots of people inside the church, because the people in the biggest chains and darkest prisons are not people who know that they are adulterers and murderers. It's the people who think that they aren't. We are, according to Francis Spufford, a league of the guilty. And this is what he says. Christianity isn't supposed to be about gathering up the good people and excluding the bad people, for the very simple reason that there aren't any good people. Christianity can slip into being a club or a cozy affinity group or a wall against the world, but it isn't supposed to be. What it's supposed to be is a league of the guilty. Yesterday, when I woke up, I grabbed my Bible from my bedside table to prepare for today. It's not that I hadn't done any preparation before yesterday morning, but I was making final preparations for this morning, and I grabbed my Bible, and it literally, okay, you know, I'm not Pentecostal, okay, if you know what that means. I'm not, but there are Pentecostal moments in my life, okay, as there should be for all of us. And I grabbed my Bible from my bedside table, and it literally fell open to the book of Hosea. As I was getting ready to prepare for this morning, make final preparations for this morning, it literally fell open to the book of Hosea. Now, if that doesn't seem like a big deal to you, it was a big deal to me because of the story of Hosea. Flip with me to Hosea. It's in the Old Testament. It's about all the help I can give you. It's right after Daniel, and right before Joel, which is where I'm sure most of you had your devotions this morning, either there or Habakkuk. Hosea, in my Bible, it's on page 751, but that doesn't help you at all. If you're not familiar with the story of Hosea, God commissions a prophet named Hosea to go to his disobedient and idolatrous people, the people of Israel. God's people had given themselves over to idolatry, had given themselves over to heinous sin and sinful practices, and so God calls and commissions Hosea to go speak to them. And God comes up with a very strange, awkward, somewhat painful way for Hosea to communicate the message that God wants him to communicate. So read with me, not out loud, just follow along with me. Hosea, this will give you some context. Hosea chapter 1, beginning in verse 2. When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go, take to yourself a wife of whoredom, and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord." So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblam, and she conceived and bore him a son. Okay, now this is God's This is God's plan. Okay, he has something to say to his idolatrous, adulterous people. The same people that he brought out of slavery from Egypt, the same people that he rescued by parting the Red Sea, the same people that he gave the promised land to, the same people that he spoke to through Moses by issuing the 10 Commandments. These were specially blessed people. These were people that God had wedded himself to, that God had given his special love to, his special attention to, and they were off sleeping around, literally and figuratively. And so God wants to get their attention, and he raises up Hosea and he says, go marry a prostitute. I know since the time you were a little boy, you have been praying that I would send you a woman to marry. Well, here she is, okay? I want you to go marry a prostitute because I want to demonstrate for my adulterous people that I am not only aware of their sin, but I am committed to them. I am wedded to them. Okay, so then flip over to chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. Hosea goes and marries Gomer. He goes and marries Gomer, and they have children together. Okay? God says here, in the last part of verse 2 of chapter 1, go take to yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom. Bring children into this world from this prostitute. Well, her wicked ways don't end. Okay, Hosea goes and he marries Gomer, and Gomer continues to sleep around, continues to be a woman of the night, continues to be adulterous and promiscuous and all of those things while she's married. Look at what God says in verse 1 of chapter 3. And the Lord said to me, go again, love a woman who is loved by another man and is an adulteress, talking about the same woman here, even as the Lord loves the children of Israel, though they turn to other gods and love cakes of raisins. Now, I don't know what that's supposed to mean, okay? I don't know what's wrong with eating cakes of raisins, but apparently I hate raisins, so this resonated with me, but whatever. Don't try to turn this into God saying something about wine either, okay? That's not what's going on here. But this is what's going on. So he marries her, Hosea marries Gomer, has children with this prostitute. She continues to sleep around. And God says each time, go buy her back. Not just go rescue her and drag her out by her hair and scold her. Go pay for her. Your wife. Go buy her. She's a prostitute. Go pay what she asks and bring her back. Redeem her, in other words. This is a crazy story. Okay, this is insane. I mean, we read something like this from a long, long time ago, and we just can't existentially resonate with this because this is so far away from anything we have ever experienced, literally. Okay, I mean, this is just craziness. God is saying something outrageous. Go buy her back. Go get her. Each time she leaves you in the middle of the night to go sleep with someone else, I want you to get up out of bed and go buy her and bring her back home each time. And then verse 2 of chapter 3, so I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and a homer and a lethek of barley. Her husband, the one she was married to, the one that she was being radically unfaithful to. And he continues to go buy her back. What in the world is going on here? I mean, what is God trying to say? What is he saying about us? What's he saying about him? What is God communicating through this crazy story, through this crazy experience of Hosea and Gomer, what in the world is going on? You see, the overarching reach of this commandment is intended to expose our faithlessness. Our faithlessness. The fact that we are all Gomers, we are all adulterers, we are all wives of whoredom. All of us. Every single one of us. This is what God is communicating. He's showing us something about ourselves, and at the same time, he's showing us something about just how radical, just how crazy, just how unconditional his love toward people like us are, toward adulterers, toward murderers. You see, we live, all of us, for things and long for things that are smaller than God. He has wedded himself to us, and we can't seem to help but sleep around. We can't help it. I mean, we look for life by getting in bed with things like getting our way, making a name for ourselves, fulfilling our dreams at whatever the cost, financial stability, attaining power, and that's just the surface stuff. When you get under the surface, it's even darker. Underneath our longings and pursuits is the adulterous idea that we can save ourselves through these pursuits, that we can rescue ourselves through these things. It's not, for instance, adulterous to want love. That's not adulterous. It's not adulterous to want love. It is adulterous to believe that finding love will save you. We're all guilty of that. It's not adulterous to pursue your dreams. It's adulterous to believe that the fulfillment of your dreams will save you. That is adulterous. It's not adulterous to want what's best for your kids. Who doesn't want what's best for their kids? It's not adulterous to want what's best for your kids. It is adulterous to believe that your kids turning out a certain way will save you. It's not adulterous to want a good reputation. It is adulterous to believe that generating a good reputation will rescue you. It's not adulterous to pursue hobbies, to enjoy the good things that God has given us. It is adulterous to believe that those good things God has given us in and of themselves can save us. When you begin to delve under the surface of your own heart, you begin to realize that adultery is not a sin that is reserved for the kinds of people that we think it's reserved for. It's for you. It's for me. I mean, we all hunger and thirst for meaning and love and approval and value, and in and of themselves, those things are not bad. In fact, we were created to experience those things. It's when we seek to satisfy our hunger and thirst for all that stuff in order to find freedom and fullness of life that our adulterous ways are exposed. So, if you haven't had an affair in the way that we typically think about it, you're not off the hook. In fact, you're just as much on the hook as someone who has. This commandment levels the playing field, as all commandments are intended to do. The law, as I've said, is like a mirror. It is intended to show us who we really are and what we really need. The law, as I've said, eliminates the us versus them distinction. There is no, when you take God's law seriously and you understand the reach and the depth of his commandments, and you understand the reach and the depth of his demands, there is no more us versus them distinction. The Bible knows no us versus them distinction. It knows us and him, but it does not know us and them. This levels the playing field. Martin Luther put it this way: the law forces a person to abandon the idea that he, in fact, has the strength to fulfill it. I mean, that's just so succinctly put. The law forces a person to abandon the idea that he, in fact, has the strength to fulfill it. Only an inflexible picture of what God demands is able to penetrate the depth of our need and convince us that we never, ever, ever outgrow our need for grace, that grace never gets overplayed. I mentioned this last week. The only kinds of people who say, yes, grace, but, are the kinds of people who cheapen God's law. Because if you understand just how demanding and far-reaching even a commandment like this is, you'll never find yourself saying, yes, grace, but, ever. So here's the good news. Our helplessness before the totality of divine expectation is what creates the space for God's amazing grace and the freedom it produces. I'm going to say that again. This was like a game changer for me when I understood this. Our helplessness before the totality of divine expectation is what creates the space for God's amazing grace and the freedom it produces. The doctrine of total depravity, you've heard me talk about this before. Total depravity is the idea that sin affects us in the totality of our being. Okay, it's different from utter depravity. Utter depravity is this idea that we are all as bad as we could possibly be. And thankfully, God's restraining grace keeps even the worst of us from becoming as bad as we could possibly be. All of us could be worse, in other words. Total depravity, on the other hand, is the idea that sin has affected us and continues to affect us in the totality of our being. There is no part of you and me that is sin-free, even after you become a Christian. Paul makes that clear in Romans 7. Even after you become a Christian, there's no part of you that is sin-free. Total depravity is the idea that the totality of who you are, your thoughts, your affections, your doing, your saying, all of those things are affected by sin. Well, the doctrine of total depravity, in a certain sense, is good news. And this is why it's good news. Because the doctrine of total depravity allows for an honest acknowledgement of human fallibility and for the astonishing possibility of grace. I'll put it in simple terms. You will never, ever know how amazing God is until you realize how messed up you are. Okay, to the degree to which you think God is amazing and His grace is amazing is commensurate with how you think about yourself. So, to put it in theological terms, a high anthropology leads to a low Christology. All right? If you think high about yourself or higher than you ought, you will think less of Jesus. Whereas a high Christology or a low anthropology leads to a high Christology. Okay, when you recognize that you are far worse than you think you are, it makes you much more appreciative for Jesus and what He's done and what He's accomplished for people like you and me. The way of God's grace becomes absolutely indispensable because the way of God's law is absolutely inflexible. And here's even more good news. God's love and acceptance of us is not dependent on our faithfulness, but Jesus' faithfulness for us. Okay, think about that for a second. Okay, because that's not our default mode. Our default mode is God's love and acceptance of us is basically dependent on our faithfulness, on me and what I do. But the good news is that God's love and acceptance of us is not dependent on our faithfulness, but Jesus' faithfulness for us. Everywhere we are faithless, He was faithful. Think about Jesus being tempted in the wilderness to worship something smaller than His Father. Okay, He was, in a sense, offered the world. Now, you have to remember that Jesus was, and this is a mystery, okay, but He was fully God, but He was also fully man, okay? I know that's in God's economy, when it comes to Jesus, 100% plus 100% equals 100%. Okay, and I don't get that. It's not 50% God, 50% man equals 100% God-man. It's 100% God, 100% man. So we can't say, yeah, but He was God. Okay, but he was, Hebrews tells us, exactly like you and me. I talked about that last week. The things he faced, the difficulties and trials and temptations he faced were all of the trials and temptations that you and I face, all of the difficulties that you and I face. Betrayal, not getting your way, people that you trust and love bailing on you, being mocked, being scorned, being gossiped about. All of those things that make our life hard are the same things that made Jesus' life while he was on earth hard. He is our great high priest who is able to sympathize with us because he was us. Okay? And so it's important to keep that in mind, because when he was being tempted in the wilderness by the devil and being literally offered the world, he was being tempted by the devil to worship something, to get in bed with something smaller than his father, to become an adulterer. He resisted. Through much pain and agony, he resisted. And that faithfulness of his is now given to us. So his accomplishment, for instance, in refusing to get in bed with something or someone smaller than his father is now given to us. That's not just Jesus' record, it's our record too. That's mind-blowing to me. It's not just his record. It's not like, well, Jesus is a great example for us to follow. Good luck, okay? He's a great example for us to follow. Well, sure. He is a great example for us to follow. He's the best example that ever lived for us to follow. The problem is we don't, and we can't to the degree that he did. And so, as I mentioned last week, this whole thing, the crux of the good news of the gospel is not our transformation. What would Jesus do? Okay, the crux of the good news is, what has Jesus done? The crux of the good news is substitution, not our transformation, which is not that impressive anyway. You see, because remember when Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist, and a voice from heaven says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." This is the Father speaking this way of his Son. Because this is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased is true of Jesus, well done, good and faithful servant is true of us. It's crazy. I grew up, and I, for whatever reason, had inherited this idea that the focus of the Christian faith was the life of the Christian, and that basically this whole thing was Jesus, as I've said, blood, sweat, and tears got us in, but it was my blood, sweat, and tears that were required to keep me in. And so I heard lots of sermons on well done, good and faithful servant. And I'm sure if you grew up in church, you did too, and you know the line. It's like, do you not want to hear that one day? You'd be a fool not to want to hear from God's own lips, well done, good and faithful servant. Well, let's go. Come on, get with the program. You're clearly not going to hear that if you continue to think the things that you think and talk to your spouse the way that you talk and ignore your kids the way that you ignore them and give yourself over to your career the way that you have, as you entertain greedy, lustful, idolatrous thoughts, as you act out in various ways or fail to act in the ways that you're called to act. If you continue this way, sinner, you're never ever going to hear, well done, good and faithful servant. So, let's go. Come on. Look at all that God in Christ has done for you. Can't you get out there and do something radical for Jesus? Okay? Because if you don't, take Jesus' conversation with the rich young ruler seriously. Fire sale, man. Sell it all. You have a car, you're not going to hear it. You have a roof over your head, you're not going to hear it. If you have not forsaken your mother and your father, and you're not going to hear it, okay? These are the demands. They're crazy. And this idea that if we can just dot our I's and cross our T's, we will hear from the mouth of God, well done, good and faithful servant, is preposterous. Okay, it's insane. Absolutely insane. So Are we ever going to hear that? How are we going to hear that? I mean, how? Because God the Father said to his Son, "This is my Son in whom I am well pleased." To all those who are in Christ, we will hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant," not because of what we have done, but because of what Jesus has accomplished on our behalf, okay? So, we will, to use some other theological language, we will hear those words not because of our improvement, but because of Christ's imputation. That he has delivered to us, minus our merit, what Jesus has accomplished on our behalf. So his record is our record. His righteousness is our righteousness. His perfect fulfillment of the law and refusal to sleep around is our perfect fulfillment of the law and refusal to sleep around, even though we, like Paul in Romans 7, just can't seem to stop going back to those dry cisterns. The things that I want to do, I don't do. And those things that I don't want to do, those are the things that I keep doing. Who is going to rescue me from this body of death, a wretched man that I am? And then the next verse, thank God for Jesus. Because if God's love for me and God's approval of me was dependent on my record, on my resume, I'd be in big trouble. Because God does not love us based on progress. He loves us based on Christ's perfection. That's how we are adopted into God's family, loving, gracious family. Not because of our progress, but because of Christ's perfection. It's the only thing God accepts. And let me tell you even more benefits of acknowledging your adulterous ways. That's what I want us all to do. I want us to be honest about how adulterous we all are. And there are some real practical, horizontal benefits that come along with being honest, that come along with taking our masks off and acknowledging that we're bad. Listen to me, there is no hope. And I know the self-esteem culture of America has convinced you probably since the time you were in grade school otherwise. But the fact of the matter is, there is no benefit to believing you're good. Zero benefit to believing that you're good. But I mean, tell me something good about myself. Why? I mean, literally why? So that you can be encouraged? I mean, I don't know. There is so much freedom. I can't even begin to tell you how much freedom there is in acknowledging that you are bad. Because then it takes your eyes off of you and goes, thank God for Jesus. And because of what he's done, nothing can separate me from God's love. I'm in forever and I didn't do anything except mess this up. That's freedom. Okay, and it resonates with people. It certainly resonates with people outside the church. I've said it before, but I mean, the world doesn't need to see our competence. They need to hear our confession that we're just as messed up as they are. We're just as broken as they are. We're just as afraid as they are. You know, we're just as weak and frail and fallible as they are. We're just as much given to unbelief as they are and doubt as they are and all of these things. There's great freedom in that, but there are some real horizontal benefits to this of acknowledging your adulterous ways. Let's go to Psalm 51. We read it this morning in our confession. It's my favorite psalm in the Bible. Psalm 51. You perhaps know the context. King David, the most mighty man in the land, happens to notice a beautiful woman bathing on her rooftop by the name of Bathsheba. He sends for her. He sleeps with her, sends her back home. She sends word, I'm assuming a couple months later. Back in those days, it's not like you could go to CVS and get a pregnancy test, okay? So I'm assuming that it took a little bit of time for a woman to realize that they were pregnant. So a couple months later, she sends word to David and says, I'm pregnant. So David's in a pickle. he's in a little bit of a pickle because she's married. She's married to one of his soldiers. And so he sends for Uriah, her husband, and says, I've got a plan. I'll invite him home from, the field of battle. Give him a couple days off, a little R&R with his wife. He's coming back from battle. I'm sure he will, sleep with his wife, and we can blame the pregnancy on his furlough, all right? Now, this probably took some time, too. I mean, you got to send someone out. You've got to get the guy back. This probably took another couple weeks. He comes back. Uriah refuses. The first night, he refuses to go sleep in his own home with his wife. He sleeps on the steps and says, how can I go in to be with my wife when all of my brothers are out there fighting? So he refuses. David scratches his head and goes, well, geez, okay, that didn't work. Let's see, what can I do? So he brings Uriah back the second night and just gets him plastered. Okay, I mean, just keep serving him drinks. Maybe if I get him drunk, he'll go home. Same thing. He didn't go. So that didn't work, so David sends him back. Sends him back with a note, a sealed note that Uriah himself carried to his overseer. And the note said, from David, put this man at the front lines. If he's not going to sleep with his wife, and I can blame this pregnancy on that, then let's get this guy killed. So he goes and, Uriah gets to the front lines, and, it probably didn't happen in one day, probably took another few weeks. This whole thing, has probably gone on for months and months and months. Word comes back that Uriah has been killed, and David immediately sends for Bathsheba and makes her his wife. And just continues living like it's no big deal until Nathan, the prophet, shows up. And says, let me tell you a story. Okay, there were two men, rich man, poor man. The poor man had one little lamb, and it was like a member of the family, and ate from the family's table and, slept with the children and all these, like a little house pet. And the guy who lived next door, the rich man, had like just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sheep. And the rich man was having a guest come in from out of town. And instead of going and grabbing one of his 10,000 lambs to cook for his guest, he sends his servant over to the poor man's house to grab his one little lamb, kill that lamb, and serve that lamb to his guest. Well, David hears this story and goes, who is this guy? Tell me right now who this guy is, because that's ridiculous. I will have him killed immediately for doing that. That's the cruelest thing I've ever heard. And what does Nathan say? You're the man. You're the guy. Thou art the man. And David falls apart. And he pens Psalm 51. A man who's been exposed, he's been caught, he sees his sin, he sees how messed up he is, and he pens Psalm 51. And he says things like we read this morning, have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions, wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Verse 7, purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. He lost joy, lost gladness, because he was confronted so profoundly with his sin. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones that you have broken rejoice. Hide your face from my sins and blot out all my iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit. Renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from your presence, and take not your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and uphold me with a willing spirit. He is coming clean. Just exposed. Sickened by what he sees in the mirror. Sickened. But then look, I love this part. Verse 13, then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will return to you. Deliver me from blood guiltiness, O God of my salvation, and my tongue will sing aloud of your righteousness. What's going on there? What's one of the practical, horizontal benefits of acknowledging your messed upness, your promiscuity, your adulterous ways? When you do that, look, like Peter, I mentioned last week, David's greatest ministry came after his most grievous sin. Then I will deliver me from blood. I am a sick, broken, selfish man. I am guilty. I am guilty. I have nowhere to run. I have no place to hide. I am guilty. I'm exposed. I've been found out. And then he says, then I will teach transgressors your ways, because now he's useful. Now he's useful. He's useful. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will return to you. You see, as I mentioned a couple weeks ago, we think that being good qualifies us to have an effective ministry, but the truth is that no one is good, and our ministries become effective when we acknowledge our badness and live out of our brokenness. His greatest ministry, like Peter's. One Old Testament example, one New Testament example. In a sense, his life began. Freedom started after his most grievous sin. Afterwards. Your life is not over if you've really blown it, if you've messed up. 1 John tells us, if you confess your sin, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sin and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. And he commissions us to go and tell the world of just how messed up we are and how gracious God is. He says, now you have something to say. Okay, what were you saying before? You may have been spouting off theological truth here and there and doing it in a sort of unfeeling, disconnected from the human race manner, because you never saw yourself really in your heart as an adulterer. You never really felt it. You never really felt in your heart that you were a murderer. But once you do, and you say, have mercy on me, oh God. Have mercy on me. Then you have something to say. You have a story to tell. And people will listen. People will listen to that. They don't listen to someone who speaks as if they're speaking from Sinai and they have it all together, as if they literally speak as an outsider of the human race. Let me tell you, that people just don't listen to people like that. I can't stand people like that, okay? Let me tell you, you like that voice? Let me tell you, okay? That's sort of like whatever a Pharisee sounds like in my mind, that's the voice. Let me tell you. It sounds nothing like mine, by the way. Did you pick up on that? That's how self-righteous I am. I'm Pharisaical when it comes to Pharisees. The sin just goes so deep, okay? But life and ministry and freedom begin when you are at your worst and you confess your need. That's when it starts. And the exhaustion then, sort of begins to fade, because you don't have to spend so much time putting on makeup in the morning, metaphorically speaking, okay? You don't have to spend so much time choosing your mask for the day. You don't have to spend so much time strategizing about how you have to pretend in this meeting and how you have to pretend with this person and what sort of front you need to put up when you engage these people. That's just exhausting. That's the kind of stuff that makes life absolutely exhausting. And you don't have to do that anymore. And you can resonate with people. Steve Brown says it like this. He used to get really defensive when people would come up to him and criticize him. And he was speaking at our denomination's General Assembly, which is like an annual gathering of everybody in our denomination. And he says the stuff that Steve Brown says, okay? Which if you haven't heard him, or if you have heard him, you know what that is. And he's sort of a shock jock in some ways, on purpose. He's doing it on purpose. And he's old, he'll be dead soon, so he's earned the right, okay, to be this way. But he said some of the stuff that he said, just talking about just how bad we are and how amazing God is, that God is like Hosea and we are like Gomer. We just can't help but sleep around, and God just keeps coming and getting us. 70 times 7, he's forgiving us. redeeming us, rescuing us, bringing us back, welcoming us, all of that stuff. And there were some tightwads who were there that day who didn't like what he had to say, and so one in particular came up and said, I think you're arrogant. I think you're this, I think you're that, I think you're that. And Steve said he used to get defensive when people said that stuff to him. He said now he has a much better strategy. He calls it the bingo retort. And what he does is when people say, you're this, you're that, the other, Steve goes, bingo. And if you knew the truth about me, you'd know I was far worse than anything you just called me. I'm those things and many, many more. Well, may the accuser roar of sins that I have done. I know them all and thousands more. Jehovah knoweth none. There's freedom in that. There's great freedom in that. Let me close with what is, in my opinion, the most powerful story that has ever been told to me. Told to me by a friend of mine named Rod Rosenblatt, who will be here also at Liberate. Rod's in his 70s. He's been teaching theology for a long, long time, and he is one of my pastors. A guy that I go to, that I run to, that I seek help from on a variety of different things. And he told me this story one time when we were together in Chicago for a couple of days. You're going to have to sort of substitute the particular sin that he's telling the story about for, adultery or murder or any other sin. But listen to this. A woman who had years earlier had an abortion and had never told anybody about it and felt terribly guilty about it, went to her pastor. And this is what she said. Pastor, you know that I had an abortion a number of years ago. Yes, the pastor said. Well, I need to talk to you about the man that I recently married. The pastor knew. He was the only one who knew. Well, I need to talk to you about the man that I recently married. Okay, said the pastor. Well, we met a while back and we started dating, and I thought, I need to tell him about the abortion, but I just couldn't. Then things got more serious between us, and I thought, I need to tell him about the abortion, but I just couldn't. A while later, we got engaged, and I thought, I need to tell him about the abortion, but I just couldn't. Then we got married, and I thought, I really, really need to tell him about the abortion, but I just couldn't, and I needed to talk to someone, Pastor, and you're it. And the pastor said, well, you know that we have a service for this. Let's go through that together. And so they did a service of confession and absolution, confess our sin and pronouncement of forgiveness. And when they were finished with this, she said to him, thank you so much, Pastor. Now I think I have the courage to tell my new husband about my abortion. And the pastor replied to her, what abortion? Just let that hit you. I need to tell my new husband about my abortion. What abortion? Well, may the accuser roar of sins that I have done. I know them all, and thousands more. Jehovah knoweth none. My sin is cast into the sea of God's forgotten memory. As far as the east is from the west, whether this is abortion, adultery, murder, whatever the case may be, you need to understand when you call out to Jesus and acknowledge yourself to be far more broken than you realize, far more guilty than you've ever admitted, far more messed up than you've ever felt comfortable expressing, when you do that, you are given the righteousness of Christ. And when God looks at you, when he sees you, he sees Jesus, what he's done, what he's accomplished, and what he's given to you. No more to haunt accusingly. No more to haunt accusingly, for Christ has lived and died for me. That's the gospel. That's the gospel. That's the good news that we sing, and that's the good news that we celebrate. And so there are great, great, amazing benefits to acknowledging how bad you are. Great, because when we do that, we see how good God is and how amazing his grace is and continues to be for us.